Let's go ahead and get started for today. Welcome back. We are continuing to move forward in the 7th week of this quarter as we talk about the role of race in listening and the entire listening process. This class will be doing a video that gets into the role of culture, cultural studies, and thinking a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts of this article and the ways that it approaches issues related to culture and race. So what I want to do to get us started off is a short prompt. So I know that there are a number of folks who might not have turned in their first essay. For instance, folks that are using their get out of jail free card are just falling a little bit behind. So I just wanted to do a check-in for folks that are not there yet about their current status and plan. If you've already turned in the first essay, what I want you to do is just take a moment to reflect on the experience. What went well, what didn't, as you were writing and working through this assignment. Don't worry, it's not going to affect your grade or score. It's just a chance for you to reflect on some of the things you did and can continue to work on as you're up to the next writing assignment. And then what I'd like you to do next is if you have a device with you or the ability to access Canvas to take a quick look at the prompts for the second essay. I covered them a little bit toward the end of last class, but I wanted to give you a little bit more time to give that a look, and based on what you're noticing, to take note of which of the three stands out to you right now. It's maybe an interesting prompt to write about, or if you're not entirely sure which to do yet, one that might jump out at you as a possibility. So I'll give you some time to reflect on and think a little bit about this, and again to review the available essay prompts that are linked on Canvas. If you don't have access to a device, you might start to take some time to brainstorm what ideas or issues we've talked about in the class you might be interested in using in your second essay. Go ahead and take a couple more minutes to reflect on this. And I know we covered the different problems for the second essay for the end of class. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to review those and also to help out folks that were here on Monday to start to think about that. Remember that this second essay is due on March 6th, giving you a little under 2 weeks or under 3 weeks to work on and develop and think a little bit about this one. I also, just as a housekeeping note, want to remind you all that we're not going to be meeting face-to-face for next Monday's class. Instead, I'll have a prompt for you to complete on Canvas that should take as long, if not shorter, than our regular meeting time. You'll be able to just complete that and receive attendance for the day. So we will be meeting on Friday and then the following Wednesday to go over some of these things a little bit more. So last class, we went over that second essay. Some of the key ideas related to this week's reading from Redding Jr. surrounding the issue and significance of race in the listening process. Again, this week's reading is very much an exploration of media and how media, including radio, interacts with listening and some of the challenges of engaging with the listening process. So again, that essay is coming up there. The key thesis or idea that's emerged from this week's reading, again, is the idea that the perspectives, diverse and underrepresented voices, right, that the opportunity, as you all did some research for on Monday, to look into the history of Black-owned radio stations in the United States, offer some major enclaves and opportunities for people to listen and communicate, but that the role of institutional power and ownership, right, the people who own or control the radio stations themselves also have a significant role to play in terms of ownership and the overall dynamics of how listening can happen, right? So a lot of this article is looking into, yes, while there's Black radio stations and opportunities for listening that happens, that the many ways ownership and power that comes from who controls or dictates these radio stations can also impact the listening process too. Talked a little bit about Arthur Carter's work on Afrocentrism. Again, the idea that centering issues of race, particularly a Black and African experience, is a crucial way to rethink or reinterpret or to examine, for instance, how the use of Black-owned radio was crucial during the segregation era of the United States to raise awareness of issues and challenges. For instance, you might be familiar or have heard of this idea of what's known as a sundown town, right, or a town or location that, if the sun goes down, is not considered to be safe for African Americans in the United States. The use of things like radio and media and listening was a crucial way that information and awareness about those locations was brought. We talked about how the opportunity to tell stories, share lived experiences. A lot of you mentioned, right, that a lot of these radio stations were much more focused on providing stories or interpretations of events over things like music. So that's definitely a major role too, that stories, oral histories, and so on to be shared and passed down through using media channels like radio. We're going to explore this and talk about issues of race on a larger scale today by looking into the role of cultural studies and how understanding of culture allows us to understand its relationship to media. So we have a lot of courses here at EOU focus on looking at media and media studies, including Dr. Tony Anderson teaches some really cool courses about participatory culture in media that are definitely worth looking into if you're interested in exploring the sort of study of media a little bit more. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the methodology or the approach that this article takes, right? So in these kinds of articles, the method is the way that data or information is gathered. In this article, Redding approaches the use of qualitative interviews. So we'll be explaining what those are and understanding how they fit in the article. And then I'm going to break you down to explore and address different parts of the article, including some of the key findings that they find that emerge from the study of different interviews. So I know for those of you in my small group, I talked a little bit about cultural studies, but I want to apply it here and also to show you about an 8 or 9 minute video from Stuart Hall that gets into this idea. I think understanding cultural studies is a crucial way to think about race, think about listening, and also to think about its relationship to media. So Stuart Hall was a major theorist, kind of seen as this founder or pioneer of this idea of cultural studies. Came from a Jamaican background and was really interested in understanding and comparing people of different cultures, identities, races, and so on, and how they can listen to, communicate, and understand each other. And perhaps even more significantly, Hall is very concerned with how this is mediated, right? How media plays a significant role in shaping the way that cultures understand and listen to and engage with one another. In fact, for a lot of us, there's a good chance that people that come from different cultural backgrounds as we do are not necessarily people that we engage with on a regular day-to-day basis. Media becomes a crucial way for diverse perspectives and experiences to be represented. So cultural studies, the study of culture, is very much concerned with how media convey reality, right? Media is providing, in many ways, a filter or lens. There is both framing and agenda setting. How is an issue talked about? Is, for instance, violence highlighted, or is it presented in a more constructive or tragic way? Also, agenda setting. What are the issues or topics that media considers to be important? What are the headlines? If you get that little Google News alert on your phone, what is it emphasizing as important? Cultural studies is also how we make sense of and compare different experiences. So we've talked a little bit about culture in earlier weeks in the quarter, but culture can be measured, including things like power distance, how comfortable people are talking to each other, who might be in like a supervisor, employee type of relationship, parent-child relationship, and so on. Time orientation. Is time more flexible, or is time a very rigid or linear thing? Individualism versus collectivism, and so on. These are ideas that emerge out of sort of the context of cultural studies. So I'm going to show a clip, and it's a little bit of an older video, so it's a little bit scratchy in some places. But I still think it's worth watching because it helps us to think about culture and its connection to media and connection to listening. And as you're watching, I want you to take note of and maybe take a couple notes for yourself about how culture and cultural studies can connect to our senses of race, culture, and listening. So really kind of leave a couple notes for yourself, have that food for thought, because you'll be able to use that observation to help you as you're thinking through today's activities.
if cultural studies was simply about trying to understand the distortions which the media make of a meaning whose truth we could somehow find independently of the media, it would be a very different kind of study from what it is in fact, which is trying to find out how the meanings enter into the event themselves, how they have to constitute the event. And this, what we're talking about is really why in cultural and media studies of this kind, at any rate, the notion of culture becomes a primary force. It's not a secondary element, but it's a primary element. Culture is a way in which we make sense of or give meaning to things of one sort or another. It's true, of course, that we all don't make sense of things in the same way. Therefore, that each of us has a little kind of conceptual world of our own, or rather, we have our own sort of take on the conceptual world. But if we shared no concepts together with other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in broadly speaking the same way. Cultures consist of the maps of meaning.
Has anybody ever
frameworks of
seen-
intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists.
I'm curious if anybody has ever seen or heard of the story of the elephants in the cave, or the blind folks and the elephants. That story, yeah, right. So the simple premise of that story, right, is that there's a bunch of people that are sort of asked either to go into a cave, or there are folks that are blind, right? And they're asked to understand what that thing is in there. So it's really dark. They can't see anything because they're in this cave. And depending on the person, right, and where they're located, they're going to see and experience something really different. So somebody is like feeling the trunk and they're like, oh, it's a tree. Somebody is feeling the tail and they're like, it's a rope, right? And the idea here is this idea that we're getting this small slice or small piece of the broader world. So core idea for us to think about here in media and representation and in culture, right, is that not everybody is getting the full picture. And as Hall is kind of addressing, right, media allows us to get this sort of slice of culture and identity. So I thought that was kind of a way of helping to contextualize exploration.
Hello, other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in worldly speaking sense. Culture consists of the maps of meanings, the frameworks of intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists but is ambiguous as to its meaning until we make sense. So meaning arises because of the shared conceptual maps which groups of members of a cultural society share together. And that's a very important kind of way of coming to an understanding of why in cultural studies, if you privilege the notion of representation as giving meaning, you're making culture a very central, you're giving it a kind of central role. And it's not just sort of the values and things which we happen to have been born into. It literally is the ways without which we would find the world unintelligible.
Unless we understand each other's cultures, backgrounds, senses of meaning, bridge that together, right? The world doesn't make sense.
Okay, what then is sort of the basis of a culture, consequently of cultural studies, is to try to begin with what are the shared conceptual maps. That's to put it another way, to give you another way into this notion. What are the ways in which we classify and organize the world? Because classification is not the only, but one of the principal ways in which we go about giving meaning.
Look at the sides of the
roughly
room,
what
for an
class
example,
of
right?
things it
The
is.
maps.
Roughly what it belongs with, And roughly what is different from chairs are like stools because you sit on. And both of them are different from tables which you put things on, although you can also sit on tables. Our systems of classification are very complex, but without some notion of this belongs with that, that is different, you wouldn't be able to have a conceptual map. You wouldn't be able to map out the world in some intelligible way. Now, where do we get that from? Well, the one thing you can be certain is that though the capacity to use concepts and to classify concepts this way is a biological or genetic phenomenon, feature of how we are constituted as human beings, the particular classification that we use to classify out the word meaningfully is not printed in anybody's gene. It is something you learn.
This is crucial when we're thinking about race, right? That
Adapting
classification or the way that we assign or think about that.
to
Developed.
structure, more than structure. But to become a human subject is precisely somehow to learn or internalize the shared maps of meaning with other people in the culture. To become a cultured subject, rather than a biological individual, rather than just a blob of genetic material, is to move from there, to internalize, have within oneself the kind of the beginnings of the grid of one's culture. Okay, one could say then that the conceptual maps in our heads which allow us to come to a sense of what is going on in the world is itself a system of representation. Our concepts, our way of representing the world.
Culture represents or stands in for the world, right?
Very simple way. Bear in mind an object which you cannot see. Now, unless you have a concept of it, it will disappear the moment that the object is gone from sight. But concepts allow us to store and indeed to refer to and to think about quite complicated thoughts about objects which are no longer accessible to our perceptual apparatus. So the concept allows us also to think about a wide range of things which are not in any simple sense out there in the world. That's a very rich notion. Our fantasy life is full of things which are absolutely real to us, which are probably real if we can only find a language to express them. Lots of other people which no one's ever seen. So we're beginning to dissolve now any simple-minded notion that our concepts are just mirror images of the world out there. Also mirror images of worlds that don't exist. In which some of the ways in which people in public studies have tried to explore this process of making or the production of meaning, how they try to get into what we call the practices that produce meaning. And that idea is a very important one, the notion that the production of meaning is not therefore something that just happens because the word is already fixed out in its meanings, which don't change. The production of meaning means that there is a kind of symbolic work, an activity, a practice which has to go on in giving meaning to things and in communicating that meaning to someone else.
Radio.
And it is that practice of the production of meaning, practice of signifying practices, practices that are involved in the production of meaning that media studies is concentrated on the effects and the products of signifying practices and carrying meaning, and that in our world happen to be widely circulated by the media. One of the most powerful and extensive systems for the circulation of meaning, although one ought to always remind oneself, especially in media studies, that the media are by no means the only means by which meaning is circulated. The most obvious way is in actual in personal communication. That is the medium in which the exchange of meaning absolutely saturates the world. But of course, we are right, noticing that to see what happens when systems, complicated institutional systems, with complicated technology, then intervene and take the place of face-to-face, person-to-person communication and exchange, and the means of circulating those meanings become very widespread. Because, of course, the question of the circulation of meaning almost immediately. How, who, in what channel to circulate which meanings to whom. But it's why the issue of power can never be bracketed out from the question of representation.
So there's a lot to unpack here and a lot of ideas, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff that I think is crucial and super helpful for us as we're thinking about this article, exploring it, again, exploring the issue of culture. So a couple things that I wanted to highlight as we were watching, right, is not only the idea that culture is sort of like this filter, right? It's a way of representing and thinking about the world. One example I like to use is it's like a pair of glasses, right? I have the glasses that have this blue light filter, right? So when you're looking at a computer screen, the like blue waves kind of bounce off. And that means that when I'm looking around and looking at a screen, it's like slightly distorted. The blue color isn't quite there in the same way, right? So this lens or this way of looking at the world is very similar to culture, right? One good example of this is thinking about how different cultures view like celestial bodies. For instance, a lot of indigenous cultures have stories and myths and perspectives on the sun, how the sun was created, right? Is the sun a sort of god or entity? And that's very different than how maybe somebody that comes from a more like very hard science perspective might look at the sun, right? But those are kind of very different in sort of overlapping ways of making sense of or representing that kind of experience. So that's one component that I think is crucial, is that culture is a sort of lens or filter that we use to look at the world. Another example that Hall brought up toward the end there is you might be familiar with all the stuff surrounding the O.J. Simpson trial. They also did a couple adaptations. They did a documentary and then they did like a dramatized version a few years ago surrounding that trial. And this is a really interesting case because not only were there ways that that story was discussed and circulated through media, but also a lot of differences in how that story was understood. For instance, the majority of folks that were white felt that O.J. Simpson was guilty. Majority of people polled at the time who are Black actually believed that he was not guilty. There were a lot of very different cultural interpretations of that event, of that trial, and ways that that issue was understood, right? So that's an interesting way of how cultures interpret or think about media differently. And another thing to think about too, as Hall brought up toward the end, was this idea of media ownership, right? That media provides us with crucial information that shapes the way that we think about and perceive the world. But as he brought up right toward the end, power is crucial to understanding and thinking about these kinds of issues. If we find ourselves critical of bias in media, it seeming to favor one side or perspective over another, right? Or of the kinds of issues or topics that get brought up in media, or about what companies own media. It's really interesting to track that over time. For instance, if you track the kinds of articles and content that the Washington Post has covered since it was purchased by Amazon, right? It's very different. And that change in ownership has definitely reflected some of the content and the ways they talk about issues like taxation of corporations. It's been interesting. So there's definitely ways that media ownership and power then shape the way that media is conveyed and media reaches the public, right? So I think this is a really good way of thinking about some of the core ideas that come up in this week's reading. It helps us to think about, since cultural studies is mentioned a couple times, why the heck that matters for our overall discussion. Rather than having you work on this section, in groups. I think we kind of hit on some of these ideas already. Again, some of the core ideas of culture as something that is sort of this filter, the lens of shared experiences, and also that culture helps us to understand the relationship between race and media, because not only of how things are framed or approached through media, but also the ways that people choose to discuss and talk about. Using that and using that kind of background, what I'm going to ask you all to do in just a little bit is to explore that through some sections of the article. But before we do that, the other thing that I wanted to mention a little bit is about the method or the approach that the author takes in this article, right? I think this is a really interesting one because Redding Jr. looks at Black folks that have formally occupied roles in media and radio production, right? And was really trying to understand the lived experiences and perspectives that come from that experience. So sometimes if you're reading an article for a class, or you're thinking about maybe your own research for something like a senior capstone, right? You might be familiar with interview studies. Interviews, I think, are great. They're designed to make sense of experience, you know, to engage people that have expertise surrounding particular topics. And one of the core ideas here is this idea of qualitative interview. How many folks have heard kind of like qualitative versus quantitative? We're familiar with those terms. Yes, most of you. Qualitative, you can think about as quality, right? Qualitative interviews are more about really trying to get rich and significant details. The advantage of those, right, is that you get this really interesting and important information about the human experience. The downside of qualitative interviews is that you can't quantify or transfer that information in quite the same way, right? You can't put it in a spreadsheet. You can't say, well, I learned a lot from this person. This explains the world, right? You can't transfer it in the same way. When I've done qualitative interviews myself for research, that's been a challenge, right? Is to talk about how there's valuable experience here, but also to limit the way that you could transfer it or use it elsewhere, right? So I think this is useful to think about because, again, this article is very much about trying to understand the quality and the specifics of information that's gathered with folks that have been involved in media and radio production. So what I want us to do now, as the second part of attendance, you can work together, but I will ask you to just write down and jot down individually, I'm going to ask each group to explore a different part of this article. I've also indicated the page number where this section starts, right? So this article is set up with an introduction, an overview of the approach that's taken, right? And these sort of three sections that involve the analysis and work of doing the interviews. So what I want each group to do is to discuss and then have each person in a group write down the key findings and observations from this section of the article, how these observations could connect to issues of race and culture more broadly, and also some of the ways that the observations here are able to connect to listening. So let's have the Zoom folks, Destiny, Murray, and Travis, focus on this first section over here. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Focus on this second section here. And we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Focus on this third section here. So if you don't have access to the article yourself, you might look over somebody's shoulder or just check in with other members of the group that do. So take some time, look through these sections of the article and take some notes for yourself about what you're observing and noticing in this article and the findings that come up from these interviews. Go ahead and make a breakout room for you all as well.
Yeah.
raise your hand if you'd like some more time on this. Okay. I'll let you continue to work on that, and then I'll have folks share for next class. I'll give you about 3 or 4 more minutes to continue working on this. I'll give you a hint if you have already finished. This week's quiz is not multiple choice. It's instead asking you to look at some of the sections and aspects of this article. So you can use some of the things you've done in class today as a little bit of a head start. Right. So looks like most folks are about wrapped up, so I'll go ahead and the breakout room. As mentioned, what I'll have people do is share some of the observations and things that you picked up in reading through the article. For Friday's class, we'll start out with that just as a way to refresh and continue to think about some of these ideas. We'll appreciate your work to research and look a little bit into this article. Again, this will directly help you since your quiz is asking you to look into some of these sections and some of the core ideas and findings here too. So to wrap up some of the core things that we went over for this class, we looked into cultural studies. Again, Stuart Hall's work on history and context. And I think this video does a great job of thinking about how culture is the set of mental frameworks we use to make sense of the world. The ways that this article looks into issues, culture, identity, race, and so on. And also we talked a little bit about qualitative interviews and the idea that these kind of rich narrative accounts that have come up through the article are a way of making sense of our experience. So for next class, we'll further examine some of the implications of listening and race here and give you the chance to share some of the things that emerged from the article that really stood out to you. So again, I think this helps us to have a little bit more context and information to help prepare. Go ahead and you can either fast forward or email me your prompts for today. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.